At the end of my most recent video, I teased a possible connection between the character of Thomas Zane from the game Alan Wake and the entity known as Polaris from the game Control. At the moment, nobody knows for certain who these characters are. The characters, as well as the narrative, were purposefully written to be enigmatic, in order to encourage the gamer to make up their own minds instead of having the narrative force-fed to us in a convoluted manner. However, there are subtle clues left for us in cutscenes and supplementary materials which help point us in the right direction. We just need to pay attention. I detailed one of the primary clues in the last video, that being the heavy influence of Carl Jung's psychoanalytic theories on both Control and Alan Wake. It is here that I believe we will find our answer for who Polaris is, and by extension, Thomas Zane. Though some of my long-term viewers might roll their eyes at the over-application of Jung in my videos, I ask that you listen to my argument first. You will at least see why I'm being reasonable in evoking Jung's theories, even if you ultimately disagree. What is arguably Jung's most famous contribution to the field of psychology is his theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious, a theory that is referenced in several of Control's supplementary materials. Though each human being has a personal unconscious where we store our memories, thoughts, and ideas, the collective unconscious binds all human beings together. It is a force which sets the parameters and patterns of each human being's life. It is from the collective unconscious that a human being inherits both the instincts and the images that are found in all other humans. For example, every child has a mother and father. That is a universal pattern to human life. Now I have to ask a question that might bend your mind a little. Who or what made it that a mother and a father must be a universal pattern in human life? What initial force set that pattern in motion, and at what point in time did that happen? Well, nobody knows for sure, but we can refer to it abstractly as the archetype. For each universal pattern to human life, there is an archetype, and these archetypes reside within the collective unconscious. As I explained in the last video, the whole point of Control is to come into contact with the forces of the collective unconscious in physical form. If you are having a hard time wrapping your head around this, the information I presented in my last video should help you comprehend what I am presenting now. Please go watch it if you haven't already. The forces of the collective unconscious are bleeding into our world, and they do so by finding objects which best represent the archetypal force. This is why the Federal Bureau of Control forbids certain objects as seen in the very first document of the game. In the Prohibited Items Reminder, it states that any objects considered iconic representations of an archetypal concept are not permitted past the security checkpoint. Because the FBC is so closely connected with the world of the unconscious, an undesirable force could find expression in an archetypal object and wreak havoc upon our world. These forces, and the objects they find expression in, constitute many of the threats we face in Control. These are the altered items. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, the most important archetype I would like to focus on is the archetype of the self. The self is the counterpart to the archetype of the ego. Simply put, the ego is you. It is the person you are in the present moment. The self is the ultimate person you could be. The space between the ego and the self is the path of moral development you must walk in order to become the best version of yourself. And we walk that path by following our conscience. The human being, the ego, is bound to the self in the same way that reality is bound to the archetypes. According to Jung, many religions and cultures throughout several millennia attempted to symbolize the self. For example, the Christians symbolized the self, unconsciously or not, in the form of Christ. The Buddhists symbolized the self with Buddha. This is due to the fact that both Christ and Buddha were viewed as perfect men who should be emulated. By emulating these two beings, their human followers might approach closer approximation to their own ultimate selves, their Jungian selves. One of the most common symbols of the self is that of the mandala. Quote, "The self appears spontaneously in the shape of specific symbols, and its totality is discernible above all in the mandala and its countless variants. Historically, these symbols are authenticated as God images." What Jung means by this is that we see mandalas in most of the world's dominant religions and cultures. We see them in churches and in art. In Jung's case, his patients would draw mandalas or experience them as inner images during times of psychic disorientation or reorientation. The mathematical harmony and beauty of a mandala is what best symbolizes the perfection a human being feels once they achieve their divine self. Even before I bring this back to control, I'm sure most of you have already figured out the connection I'm about to draw. The moment we start the game, what image do we see? We see Polaris in the same form we see her throughout the game, that of a mandala. Now granted, mandalas are such ubiquitous art forms and they don't necessarily prove that Polaris has something to do with the Jungian self. That is a fair point, but I ask that you not think too deeply about it until after I am done making my argument. Jung's analysis of the mandala symbol extends throughout his collected works, but is arguably most thoroughly discussed in volume 9.1 and 9.2. One is called, appropriately, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and the other is called Ion. As many of my regular viewers are well aware, I spent the first half of this year doing videos on the book Ion, doing one video per chapter. The concept of the self and its symbolic expression were the central focus of that book. There were several symbolic expressions of the self in that book, only two of which were the mandala and Christ. For those of you who watched that series, you might recall the image of the North Pole also being a symbol of the self. Jung's evidence for this is as follows. Many religions and cultures were unconsciously motivated to project the location of their gods onto the North Pole. For the Egyptians, the north was the region of Set, and was at the same time the abode of the four sons of Horus. For the Babylonians, Anu has his seat in the northern heaven. Likewise, Marduk, as the highest god, world creator and ruler of its courses, is the pole. For the alchemists, the seat of Mercurius was found in the North Pole. Mercurius was the infernal fire who dwells at the North Pole and reveals himself through magnetism, and who guides men on their perilous voyage over the sea of the world. Now, prior to the widespread use of compasses, whose magnetism helped guide sailors over the sea of the world via a needle that always pointed north, sailors had to use something else. They needed another fixed point other than the magnetic North Pole to guide them. For a time, they used a fixed point in the sky, a point that barely moved, a pole star. The pole star that was most often used was known as Polaris. And just like the gods which resided at the North Pole, Polaris was also a symbol of the self. Much like how the self operates through our conscience, guiding us on a journey towards our ultimate self, the pole star guided our ancestors on their respective journeys. And here's something that will blow your mind. Jung pointed out in Ion that if you did a time lapse of the North Pole, this is the image that would appear. A cosmic mandala. How appropriate is it that mandalas are symbols of the Jungian self, of the God image, and that the gods of various religions resided in the north? The mandalas, the north, and the pole star are all virtually synonymous. They are all symbols of the self. In respect to Jessie Faden in Control, she is guided by the entity known as Polaris throughout the Bureau. Polaris operates in her mind. Much like, as I just said, the Jungian self operates through our unconscious, through our conscience. Upon completing the main story, when Jessie completes her journey, we see her floating in the center of Polaris. This is because she has become synonymous with the self, with Polaris. Her name literally becomes Jessie Polaris, and becoming the director of the FBC, she has effectively become a god, being able to mediate between the objective and subjective worlds and contend with cursed objects and monsters, and she could not have done it without the guidance of her own Jungian self. As fascinating as this might be, I have yet to mention anything regarding the character of Thomas Zane. While I think the evidence in regards to the nature of Polaris is pretty strong, my beliefs regarding who Zane is are based more around inference rather than evidence, though there is evidence to back me up. However, I don't think my inferences are entirely unreasonable. The inference I wish to make is that where Polaris is Jesse's Jungian self, Thomas Zane might be Alan Wake's Jungian self. Think about it. The DLC seems to confirm a long-held fan theory that Zane and Wake are the same person, right? Much like how Jesse and Polaris are, or at least become, the same person, or the same being. In the original Alan Wake game, Thomas Zane often appears as a bright light in the sky, guiding Wake on his journey. This is much like how Polaris the Star and Polaris the Force guided their respective adventurers. Let's also not forget that Zane guides Wake to a lighthouse in the Alan Wake DLC, another source of guiding light to seafarers on their journeys through the world. Finally, there might be some clues hidden in the etymology of the names Thomas and Zane. Zane, in Arabic, means God is gracious. How appropriate considering that the North Pole, Polaris, and the Jungian self are all synonymous with gods. The name Thomas, in Aramaic, means twin. If Polaris is Jesse's Jungian self, I think it is reasonable to suggest that a man whose name means God twin might be Wake's Jungian self. But those are just one man's thoughts. I could be wrong. If you have differing ideas regarding who or what Polaris and Thomas Zane are, I'd like to hear from you in the comments section. Also, if you liked this video and found it helpful, please hit the like button. I cannot explain to you guys how much hitting that simple button helps me. Also, I'd like to plug the YouTube channel, Gaming University, once again. His work is the best when it comes to analysis of Control and Alan Wake. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description box below. I'm also expecting him to leave a comment on this video where he provides his own theory about Polaris and Thomas Zane. I'll pin it when he does. Finally, make sure to follow me on Twitch. That's where I'll be doing the majority of my content for the next little while. There's a link to that once again in the description box below. Until next time, just remember, stay yellow.